March 1971, an Israeli radar station in the Sinai desert picks up a contact coming in from Egypt. The operators check their screens, then check them again because what they're seeing shouldn't be possible. The target is at 63,000 feet, higher than any fighter can fly, and it's moving at Mach 2.5, then Mach 2.8, then faster. Israel scrambles its best interceptors, American-built F-4 Phantoms, the pride of Western air power. They climb with everything they have. The intruder doesn't even change course. It simply walks away from them, cruising over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth as casually as a tourist strolling through a park. Israeli Hawk missiles are launched. They can't reach it. Nothing can reach it. The aircraft crosses the entire Sinai Peninsula, photographs everything worth photographing, and disappears back toward Cairo. Total time in Israeli airspace, a few minutes. Total damage done to it, none. On one later flight, Israeli radar clocks one of these mystery aircraft at Mach 3.2, over 3,200 kilometers per hour. No fighter on the planet, no missile in any Western arsenal can touch it. In the Pentagon, analysts give the mystery aircraft a code name, Foxbat, and as the intelligence reports pile up, a very uncomfortable picture forms. The Soviet Union, the enemy, the other side of the Cold War, appears to have built a combat aircraft that is faster than anything in the West, flies higher than anything in the West, and judging by the satellite photos of its enormous wings, probably outturns anything in the West too. For the first time since the Second World War, the United States Air Force has to seriously consider that it might be second best. Fighter pilots are briefed that if they ever see a Foxbat, their best option may simply be to run. Congress is warned of a Foxbat gap. Billions of dollars are redirected. An entire new generation of American fighters, including the most famous fighter jet ever built, will be designed specifically to counter this one Soviet machine. And here's the twist, the reason this story is worth 35 minutes of your time. Almost everything the West believed about the MiG-25 was wrong. The truth, when it finally fell into Western hands in 1976, in the cockpit of a stolen jet flown by a disillusioned Soviet lieutenant, was stranger than the myth. The terrifying superfighter was, in some ways, almost primitive, a brute force machine of welded steel and vacuum tubes. And in other ways, it was a work of desperate genius that Western engineers openly admired. This is the story of the MiG-25 Foxbat, the aircraft that terrified the West, the panic it created, the secrets it hid, and what happened when the most feared airplane of the Cold War finally landed, engines screaming, in the middle of a Japanese civilian airport. To understand why the MiG-25 exists at all, you have to look not at Moscow, but at America in the late 1950s, because the Foxbat was born as an answer to an American nightmare that never actually arrived. In 1957, the United States Air Force was developing something that still looks like science fiction today, the North American XB Valkyrie, a six-engine strategic bomber the size of an airliner gleaming white, designed to cruise into the Soviet Union at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, at 70,000 feet. Too high for Soviet fighters, too fast for Soviet missiles. Each Valkyrie would carry thermonuclear weapons, and the plan was to build a fleet of them. And the Valkyrie wasn't alone. At Lockheed's secret skunk works, Kelly Johnson's team was building the A-12, which would become the SR-71 Blackbird, a Mach 3.2 reconnaissance aircraft designed to overfly Soviet territory with total impunity. From Moscow's perspective, the pattern was terrifying. The Americans were about to own the sky above Mach 3, and the entire Soviet air defense system, thousands of interceptors, radars, and missile batteries, would become obsolete overnight. The Soviet leadership issued what amounted to a demand: build us something that can catch a Mach 3 bomber. The task went to the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, the legendary MiG, and it was, on paper, nearly impossible. An interceptor that could reach Mach 3 needed engines of monstrous power, a structure that could survive furnace-level temperatures, and a radar powerful enough to find a bomber and guide missiles onto it, all using Soviet electronics that lagged years behind the West. Now here's the historical irony, and it's a big one. The American threat evaporated almost immediately. In 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down Gary Power's U-2 spy plane, proving that missiles, not high-flying aircraft, were the future. The Kennedy administration concluded that Mach 3 bombers were a gold-plated dead end. The Valkyrie was cancelled as a weapons program in 1961, and only 2 prototypes ever flew. One of them was destroyed in a mid-air collision during, of all things, a photo shoot. But the Soviet Union kept building its Mach 3 interceptor anyway, partly bureaucratic momentum, partly because the SR-71 was still very real, and partly because in the Cold War you prepared for what the enemy might build, not just what he did build. So the MiG-25 became something unique in aviation history, a maximum-effort answer to a question nobody ended up asking. A machine built to kill a bomber that never existed, which would instead end up terrifying the very country that had cancelled that bomber. The Cold War produced many strange loops of fear and reaction. The Foxbat may be the strangest of them all. The engineers at Mikoyan faced a problem that had broken lesser design teams: heat. At Mach 3, air friction turns an aircraft's skin into a stovetop. Leading edges reach 300 degrees Celsius and beyond. Ordinary aluminum, the metal that airplanes are made of, loses its strength long before that. The American solution on the SR-71 was titanium, light, strong, heat-resistant, and fantastically difficult to work with. Titanium was so troublesome that Lockheed had to invent new tools, new welding techniques, entire new factories worth of processes. And in one of history's great ironies, the CIA had to secretly buy much of that titanium from the world's largest supplier, which was the Soviet Union itself. The Soviets knew exactly how hard titanium was to manufacture at scale, and they knew their factories, staffed by workers building aircraft by the hundreds, could never handle it. So Mikoyan's engineers made a decision that Western analysts would later refuse to believe. They built their Mach 3 aircraft out of steel. Nickel steel alloy, 80% of the airframe, welded together by hand and by automatic machines, like a flying battleship. Steel is heavy. Everyone knows steel is too heavy for a fighter, and the resulting aircraft was indeed enormous, over 19 meters long, nearly 6.5 meters tall, with an empty weight of around 20 tons, more than twice an F-4 Phantom. But steel had superpowers that mattered more to the Soviets than weight. It shrugged off heat. It was cheap. It could be welded and repaired at any airbase by any competent welder, no exotic factories required. If a panel cracked in Siberia, you fixed it with a welding torch, not a special order from a titanium plant. To push this steel monster through the sound barrier 3 times over, the Tumansky Design Bureau supplied a pair of R-15 turbojets, engines with a combined afterburning thrust of over 22,000 kilograms. They were, by any measure, crude, gigantic, fuel-thirsty, originally derived from an engine meant for a disposable cruise missile. At full speed, they didn't so much burn fuel as inhale it, and above roughly Mach 2.8, they had an alarming habit of overspeeding and eating themselves alive. But they delivered thrust in quantities nothing else in the world could match. Everything about the design was brutally single-minded. Huge twin intakes, a radar in the nose, called Smirch or Tornado, so powerful it cooked rabbits near the runway when switched on at full power. The crews joked about it, but its 600 kilowatts existed to burn through American jamming. No fancy aerodynamics, no agility requirements, no compromises for dogfighting. The MiG-25 was designed to do exactly one thing: take off, accelerate to the edge of physics in a straight line, launch 4 enormous missiles at a high-flying intruder, and come home. It first flew in 1964, and almost immediately it started setting world records. The Soviet Union loved world records. Records were propaganda you could measure, and the new aircraft, flying under the deliberately misleading designation E-155, was a record-setting machine like nothing before it. Starting in 1965, Soviet test pilots began quietly demolishing the record book. Speed over a closed circuit, taken, climb records, shattered one after another. In 1973, test pilot Alexander Fedotov flew a stripped-down version to an absolute altitude record for a jet aircraft, 36,240 meters. nearly 119,000 feet. That record, set more than half a century ago, still stands today. No jet-powered airplane has ever flown higher under its own power. Western intelligence watched these records with growing alarm because the numbers were public, filed with the International Aviation Federation, and they were unbelievable. Whatever this E-155 was, it could outclimb and outrun everything in NATO's inventory. Then, in July 1967, the Soviets showed it off. At the Domodedovo Air Show near Moscow, 4 of the new jets thundered past the crowd, and Western military attachés in the audience got their first real look. A massive, slab-sided aircraft with 2 huge engines, twin tails, and enormous, broad wings. Those wings caused a 15-year misunderstanding. In the West, big wings mean one thing: agility. Wing area is what lets a fighter turn hard without losing energy. American analysts looked at the Foxbat's giant wings and drew the obvious conclusion: this thing wasn't just fast, it was maneuverable. A super fighter. The truth, which nobody in Washington could know, was that those wings were big for a completely different reason. The aircraft was made of steel and weighed as much as a loaded railway car. It needed enormous wings just to get off the ground. The Foxbat didn't have fighter wings, it had freight wings. But intelligence analysis in the Cold War worked on worst-case logic. NATO assigned the aircraft the reporting name Foxbat, and the assessments grew darker with each satellite pass over Soviet airfields. The aircraft was clearly being mass-produced. It appeared in interceptor versions and reconnaissance versions. Estimates of its performance kept climbing. Mach 3 speed, ceiling above 80,000 feet, advanced radar, possibly look-down, shoot-down capability years before the West. And in Washington, one man made the Foxbat the centerpiece of a crusade. The Secretary of the Air Force and defense analysts pointed at the MiG-25 as proof that the Soviets had leapfrogged American fighter technology. Air Force generals, still smarting from Vietnam, where their expensive Phantoms were being embarrassed by cheap, nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s, saw the Foxbat as the future of the threat. The fear wasn't cynical theater, it was genuine. The West was about to spend its way out of a nightmare, and the nightmare had a name: Foxbat. By 1970, the Foxbat panic had reached the highest levels of the American government, and its consequences were enormous. To understand why, you need to feel the mood of the moment. American air power was having a crisis of confidence. Over North Vietnam, the mighty F-4 Phantom, a 2-seat, twin-engine marvel with the most advanced missiles in the world, was achieving kill ratios that would have been considered a disaster in Korea. Small, agile gun-armed MiGs flown by North Vietnamese pilots were regularly outturning Phantoms whose designers had confidently deleted the gun because missiles had supposedly made dogfighting obsolete. The missiles, it turned out, missed a lot. So when satellite photos showed the Soviets mass-producing a huge new twin-tailed fighter that had already broken every speed and altitude record on the books, the Pentagon connected the dots into the worst possible picture. The next generation of Soviet fighter would be faster than anything American, higher flying than anything American, and thanks to those big wings, more agile too. Classified assessments described the MiG-25 as possibly the best interceptor in the world. Some officials publicly called it a threat America could not currently counter. The number that captures the panic best is this one: the United States Air Force's requirement for its next fighter, the FX program, was rewritten around the Foxbat. Speed requirement, Mach 2.5, because the Foxbat was fast. Thrust-to-weight ratio better than 1, unprecedented, because the Foxbat could climb like a rocket. A gigantic radar in a gigantic nose, because the Foxbat had one. The FX program became the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, to this day, the most successful air superiority fighter ever built, undefeated in air combat with over 100 kills and 0 losses. And the Eagle was, quite literally, designed to kill Foxbats. Its size, its power, its cost, all of it was calibrated against an aircraft the Americans had never seen up close and fundamentally misunderstood. The Navy, meanwhile, got the F-14 Tomcat with its long-range Phoenix missiles, justified in large part by by the need to stop high-fast threats like the Foxbat and the bombers it escorted. Congress approved billions. An entire generation of American air power, the teen series fighters that still fly today, was shaped in the shadow of the MiG-25. And the Soviets, watching all this from Moscow, must have been bewildered because they knew what the Foxbat actually was. They knew it couldn't dogfight. They knew its real operational speed limit. They knew its radar, for all its power, used vacuum tubes. The most effective thing the MiG-25 ever did, it did without firing a shot. It frightened the richest country on Earth into a trillion-ruble response to a threat that existed mostly in translation. But in 1971, the Foxbat was about to do something real. It was about to go to war, sort of, over the Sinai desert. In the spring of 1971, 4 strange aircraft arrived in Egypt, crated and secret, accompanied by hundreds of Soviet personnel. Officially, they didn't exist. The unit was called the 63rd Independent Air Detachment, and its aircraft were MiG-25R and MiG-25RB models, the reconnaissance versions of the Foxbat, stripped of missiles and fitted with cameras and sensors. Their mission: fly over Israeli-held Sinai and photograph everything in the tense, armed truce following the 1967 war. The flights themselves were flown exclusively by Soviet pilots, and they operated with a swagger that came from pure physics. A typical profile: take off from Cairo West, accelerate, climb to over 20,000 meters, and cross the Suez Canal at better than Mach 2.5. Camera run over the Sinai, sometimes all the way to the Israeli border and along it, then home. Time over hostile territory, minutes. Israel threw everything it had at them. F-4 Phantoms, the best interceptor Israel possessed, flew ambush patrols, zoom climbing to altitudes the Phantom was never meant to reach, launching Sparrow missiles at the edge of their envelope. Nothing worked. The missiles fell away, unable to close the gap. Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries tracked the intruders and could not touch them. On one famous occasion, in November 1971, Israeli radar clocked a MiG-25 outbound at Mach 3.2, a number that made it, that day, the fastest aircraft ever tracked in combat conditions anywhere in the world. That Mach 3.2 run deserves a footnote, because it tells you everything about the Foxbat's engineering. The aircraft's official limit was Mach 2.83. Above that, the giant Tumansky engines tended to overspeed, essentially running away with themselves, temperatures soaring past redline. The Soviet pilot who hit Mach 3.2 over Sinai made it home, but reportedly the engines were finished, fit only for removal. The Foxbat could touch Mach 3, but it paid for the privilege in wrecked turbines. It was less a cruise speed than a self-destruct setting with a return ticket. The Israelis, for their part, never managed an intercept. Neither did anyone else anywhere for the Foxbat's entire reconnaissance career. Over the following decades, MiG-25R variants would overfly Israel, Iran, and other defended airspace, and the score would remain absolute. No reconnaissance Foxbat was ever shot down by a fighter. In an era of spy satellites and stealth, it's easy to forget that for years, the fastest way to photograph your enemy was to simply fly over him faster than his missiles could fly up. For Western intelligence, Sinai confirmed the nightmare. The Foxbat was real, operational, and untouchable. What the West still didn't know was everything else: what it was made of, what was inside it, what it could and couldn't do. The Foxbat file remained a folder full of blurry photos, radar tracks, and fear. All of that was about to change, thanks to a 29-year-old Soviet lieutenant with a full fuel tank and a plan. September 6, 1976. Chugyevka Air Base, Soviet Far East. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko straps into MiG-25P, Red 31, for a routine training flight over the Sea of Japan. Belenko was on paper exactly the man the Soviet system was supposed to produce: a top student, a gifted pilot, an instructor entrusted with one of the most secret aircraft in the country. In reality, he was a man coming apart. His marriage was failing. His posting was a bleak garrison town where the housing was crumbling, the food was scarce, and the officers drank themselves numb. The paradise of workers he'd been promised since childhood looked up close, like poverty wrapped in slogans. Somewhere over the previous months, Belenko had made his decision, and he had made it carefully. That morning his formation took off for intercept training. Minutes in, Belenko peeled away, dropped to 50 meters above the sea, under Soviet radar, and pushed his Foxbat east. He flew low and blind toward Japan, burning fuel at a horrifying rate, aiming for a military airfield at Chitos. The weather betrayed him. Clouds everywhere, fuel vanishing, Japanese fighters scrambled to find the intruder, but unable to locate him in the murk. When Belenko finally broke through the cloud deck, he was nearly dry, and the airport in front of him was not the military field he'd planned for. It was Hakodate, a civilian airport, with a runway a full kilometer shorter than a Foxbat needs. He had no choice. Red 31 came screaming over a startled commercial airliner on approach, touched down hard, blew a tire, streamed its brake parachute, and skidded off the end of the runway into the dirt, stopping just short of a large antenna array. Belenko slid back the canopy, stood up, and fired 2 warning shots from his service pistol at the Japanese civilians running toward him with cameras. Then he asked for the police and asylum. What happened next was one of the great intelligence windfalls of the entire Cold War. The most feared, most secret aircraft in the Soviet inventory was sitting intact in a Japanese field. Moscow erupted, demanding the immediate return of its property and its pilot. Tokyo, after consulting Washington, replied with exquisite bureaucratic politeness. Of course, the aircraft would be returned. Eventually, after Japanese authorities completed their investigation of Mr. Belenko's illegal entry. The investigation involved dismantling Red 31 into its component pieces. The aircraft was trucked to Hyakuri Air Base, where American and Japanese engineers took it apart bolt by bolt, photographed everything, ran the radar, analyzed the metals, and X-rayed the engines. 67 days later, the Foxbat went home to the USSR in crates on a Soviet freighter, accompanied by a Japanese bill for shipping and damages. And Viktor Belenko went to America, carrying in his head the answer to the question the West had been asking for a decade. What, exactly, is a MiG-25? When the engineers at Hyakuri opened up Red 31, the myth of the superfighter died one rivet at a time. The first shock was the metal. The West had assumed titanium. The analysts refused to believe the Soviets would attempt Mach 3 any other way. What they found was welded nickel steel, 80% of the airframe, with titanium only in the hottest few places. Some of the welding was beautiful, automatic machine work. Some of it was rough, clearly done fast by hand, with visible beads that would have failed inspection at any American factory. Rivet heads were left proud, unfinished, in places where the airflow didn't care. The aircraft weighed far more than any Western estimate. Empty, it outweighed a fully loaded Phantom. The second shock was the electronics. The mighty Smerch radar, the 600-kilowatt monster, ran on vacuum tubes. Not a single modern transistorized system in the airplane's core, technology that Western engineers associated with 1950s television sets. The initial reaction was mockery, and the mockery made headlines. The dreaded Foxbat was a Stone Age machine, a bluff, proof of Soviet backwardness. And then, as they kept studying it, the laughter faded, because almost every primitive choice turned out to be smart. Vacuum tubes don't care about electromagnetic pulse. In a nuclear war, the Foxbat's radar would keep working while transistorized Western avionics fried. Tubes also let the radar pump out raw power no Western fighter could match, power designed to physically burn through American jamming. Steel meant any Soviet airbase could repair battle damage with a welding kit. The unfinished rivets were only in zones where drag didn't matter, meaning the Soviets had calculated exactly where perfection was worth paying for and where it wasn't. The aircraft was designed for a 15-year-old with a hammer to maintain. One American engineer marveled, and it would still do Mach 2.8. But the teardown, combined with Belenko's debriefing, also revealed the truth about performance, and this was the part that changed everything. The Foxbat's operational speed limit was Mach 2.83. The legendary Mach 3.2 runs destroyed its engines. Its radar couldn't see targets below it against the ground. It could pull barely 4.5 G with full tanks, less than half what an F-15 could sustain. It turned, one pilot said, like it was flying in wet cement. Its combat radius was pitiful. Belenko himself complained bitterly that at low altitude and full power, the fuel gauge moved like a second hand. It carried no gun, and its missiles were useless against anything agile. In other words, the MiG-25 was not a fighter at all. It had never been a fighter. It was a missile with a man in it, a straight-line dart built to kill high-flying bombers, and against that target, it remained genuinely formidable. The West had spent a decade terrified of an aircraft that could never have fought the fighters built to beat it. Let's pause the story here, because the Foxbat panic is one of the clearest case studies ever recorded in how intelligence goes wrong, and the mechanics of it are worth understanding because they haven't changed. Start with what the West actually had before 1976. Grainy satellite photos, airshow flybys, world record filings, and radar tracks from Sinai. Every one of those data points was real. The records were real. The Mach 3.2 track was real. The mass production was real. Nothing was fabricated. And yet the conclusion drawn from them, a Mach 3 superfighter that outflew and outfought everything in NATO, was almost completely false. The errors compounded in a very human way. The big wings were read as agility when they were actually compensation for weight. The record flights were read as routine performance when they were actually stripped-down special aircraft flown at the edge of destruction. The Mach 3.2 Sinai dash was read as an operational capability when it was actually an engine-wrecking emergency sprint. Each individual misreading was reasonable. Stacked together, they built a monster. And there was a deeper force at work, one every intelligence agency knows and none is immune to: worst-case logic. In the Cold War, underestimating the enemy could be fatal. Overestimating him merely cost money. Analysts were institutionally rewarded for imagining the most dangerous version of every Soviet weapon. Add the domestic politics, an air force that wanted funding for a new fighter, contractors who wanted to build it, congressmen who wanted it built in their districts, and the Foxbat myth wasn't just an error. It was a useful error. The scariest possible MiG-25 helped everyone's budget. The Soviets, it must be said, played their part brilliantly. They understood exactly what the West feared and fed it. The record flights were publicized under a fake designation. The Domodedovo flyby was theater. Moscow never corrected the West's inflated estimates. Why would it? For the price of a few stripped prototypes and some paperwork filed with the Aviation Federation, the Soviet Union got the United States to respect and fear its Air Force for 15 years. Here's the question historians still argue about. Was the panic actually bad for the West? Because look at what fear built. The F-15 Eagle, designed against the imaginary Foxbat, turned out to be arguably the greatest fighter of the 20th century. The F-14, the F-16, the entire renaissance of American fighter design in the 1970s, all of it was driven, in part, by a threat that didn't exist as described. The West armed itself against a phantom and accidentally built the best air force in history. There's a lesson in the Foxbat story that goes far beyond aviation. An adversary's capabilities are what they are, not what your fears, your budget requests, or your grainy photographs make of them. The truth was always sitting there, welded in steel. It just took a defector to deliver it. After Belenko's defections stripped away the mystery, the MiG-25 still had a long career ahead of it, and its combat record turned out to be exactly what the teardown predicted: helpless against fighters and nearly untouchable doing its real job. The Soviets, furious and embarrassed, upgraded the fleet. Because Belenko had given away the radar secrets, a crash program produced the MiG-25 PD with a new look-down radar and infrared sensor. The reconnaissance versions kept flying over places no other aircraft dared: Iran during the hostage crisis era, the Persian Gulf, and repeatedly over Israel, where even the F-15's arrival finally gave the Israelis a real chance. In February 1981, an Israeli F-15 at last shot down a Syrian MiG-25, using a carefully planned ambush and a look-down missile shot. The Foxbat's sanctuary, above 60,000 feet, had finally been breached, but it had taken the specific fighter designed to kill it. The Foxbat's biggest war was Iran-Iraq. Through the 1980s, Iraqi MiG-25s flew reconnaissance and bombing runs deep into Iran, and in the war's later years, terrorized Tehran itself with high-altitude supersonic bombing runs that Iranian defenses struggled to stop. Iranian F-14 Tomcats, the one aircraft in the region with the radar and missiles for the job, managed to bring several down, exactly the high-fast interception mission the Tomcat was built for. The Foxbat gave as well as it took. Iraqi MiG-25s scored kills of their own, and the type became the highest-flying combat aircraft of that entire brutal war. Then came January 17, 1991, the first night of Operation Desert Storm, and the Foxbat's most famous kill. Amid the largest air armada since World War II, an Iraqi MiG-25 flown by Lieutenant Zuhair Dawood slipped through the chaos and fired a single R-40 missile that destroyed the F-A-18 Hornet of U.S. Navy pilot Scott Spiker. It was the only American fixed-wing loss in air-to-air combat of the entire Gulf War, and it was scored by the Stone Age Steel Interceptor against the most sophisticated air campaign ever mounted. 2 nights later, another Iraqi Foxbat evaded multiple missiles from pursuing F-15s and escaped. Even in 1991, catching a fleeing MiG-25 was genuinely hard. The type soldiered on through the 1990s and 2000s in shrinking numbers. In 2002, an Iraqi MiG-25 even shot down an American Predator drone that had been sent up, absurdly, to duel with it. When American forces overran Iraq in 2003, they found the last Foxbats buried in the sand, literally. Entire aircraft entombed beneath the desert at Al-Taqadam to hide them from airstrikes, dug out by astonished American troops with excavators. Russia retired its last MiG-25s in 2013. A handful may still fly elsewhere, nobody is quite sure. Steel, it turns out, lasts. So what did the MiG-25 actually leave behind? More than you'd think, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet Union, the Foxbat's true heir arrived in 1981, the MiG-31 Foxhound. Take everything the MiG-25 got right, the speed, the altitude, the brute force interception mission, and fix everything Belenko complained about. The Foxhound got fuel-efficient engines, a 2-man crew, and most importantly, the Zaslan radar, the first electronically scanned phased array radar ever fitted to a fighter, years ahead of the West in that one respect. Where the Foxbat was a straight-line dart, the Foxhound could track 10 targets and kill 4 at once, at range, looking down. It remains in Russian service today, more than 40 years later, now carrying hypersonic missiles. Every time a Kinjal-armed MiG-31 makes headlines, you are looking at the Foxbat's grandchild. In the West, the legacy is even stranger, because it's built into aircraft that were designed against a misunderstanding. The F-15 Eagle exists in its familiar form because the Foxbat was thought to be a super fighter. When the truth emerged in 1976, the Eagle was already flying, massively overbuilt for the real threat, and that overbuilding is precisely why it became legendary, undefeated in air-to-air combat, over 100 kills, 0 losses, still in production as the F-15X half a century later. The Foxbat myth bought the West a margin of excellence it never intended to pay for. There's also a quieter legacy in engineering culture. The Hayakuri teardown became a standard lesson in design schools, the difference between crude and wrong. The MiG-25's vacuum tubes, its steel, its rough welds were not mistakes. They were correct answers to Soviet constraints, EMP resistance, factory capability, field maintenance, cost. Western engineers who came to Mach stayed to take notes. Good engineering, the Foxbat taught, is not the most advanced solution, it is the most appropriate one. That lesson has been relearned expensively many times since, by every program that chose exquisite technology over numbers, availability, and repairability. And Viktor Belenko, the man who delivered the truth, lived out the American life he'd gambled everything for. Debriefed for months, granted citizenship by a special act signed by President Carter, he became a consultant and lecturer, marveling by his own account at supermarkets. His first visit, he assumed the abundance was a staged KGB trick. He avoided publicity, flew private planes for fun, and died in Illinois in 2023 at 76 under a quiet American name. The Soviets never forgave him. He never apologized. The aircraft he stole is still the reason we know this story at all. One question remains, the one this whole video has been building toward. Knowing everything we now know, was the fear justified? What should terrify you more, the weapon as it is, or the weapon as you imagine it? So why did the MiG-25 terrify the West? Not because of what it was. We know now what it was, a steel dart with rocket engines and a television-set radar built by a country that couldn't machine titanium to shoot down a bomber that was never built. It couldn't dogfight. It couldn't loiter. Above Mach 2.8 it ate its own engines. The pilots who flew against it in exercises, once the West finally understood it, stopped fearing it entirely. The West was terrified because of what it didn't know and because of what it needed to believe. Every blurry photograph became a super fighter. Every world record became a routine capability. Every unknown was filled in with the worst case, because worst cases won budgets, and in fairness, because the price of optimism in the nuclear age was unthinkable. The MiG-25 terrified the West because fear, in the Cold War, was the rational default setting. And here's the final irony to take with you. Both sides, in a sense, got played by the same machine. The West feared an aircraft that didn't exist and spent billions countering it. The Soviets built an aircraft for a threat that didn't exist and spent billions fielding it. Two empires staring at each other through fog, each armed against the other's shadow. The Foxbat was never really an airplane. It was a mirror, and both superpowers looked into it and saw their own nightmares staring back. But let's give the machine itself the last word it deserves, because underneath the myth and the politics, the MiG-25 remains a staggering piece of engineering. It still holds the absolute altitude record for a jet aircraft, set in 1977, 37,650 meters, the edge of space, reached by welded steel. It flew combat missions over 4 decades and was never once shot down while doing the job it was actually designed for. It was built by engineers who were told the impossible was required, who had the wrong materials, the wrong electronics, and the wrong budget, and who delivered Mach 2.8 anyway with a welding torch and stubbornness. Kelly Johnson built the SR-71 out of titanium and genius, and it is rightly celebrated as the pinnacle of aviation. Mikoyan's engineers built its opposite number out of steel and desperation, and for 15 years, their crude, brilliant, misunderstood machine held the most powerful air forces on Earth in a state of quiet dread. Somewhere in that comparison is the whole Cold War. The next time you see a headline about some new weapon, some hypersonic terror, some unstoppable threat, remember the Foxbat sitting in the dirt at Hakodate, tires blown, out of fuel, vacuum tubes still warm, and remember how different the monster looked once someone finally opened it up. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more machines, myths, and the history between them. See you in the next one.